smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name?
Caylee, Caylee Anthony.
Hello? Can you tell me a little bit what's going on?
My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days.
And you last saw her a month ago?
31 days.
Why are you calling now? Why didn't you call 31 days ago?
I've been looking for her and have gone through other resources to try to find her, which was stupid. Okay. I think the officers are here.
She found out her daughter was dead, and she went dancing. She found out her daughter was dead, and she got a tattoo that said, "Beautiful Life." She found out her daughter was dead. And for 31 days, she told anyone who asked that everything was fine. Her name is Caylee Anthony, and what she did in those 31 days after her 2-year-old daughter Caylee was last seen alive is one of the most documented, most disturbing, most infuriating things any parent has ever done on American soil. We are going to go through every single one of those 31 days. Not the headlines, not the highlights. The actual days, the actual decisions, the phone calls, the receipts, the text messages, the borrowed money, the lies on top of lies on top of lies. Because by the time this video is over, you are not going to be asking how Caylee Anthony got away with it. You are going to be asking how we ever thought she wouldn't. December 11th, 2008, Orlando, Florida. A utility worker named Roy Kronk is doing his rounds near a quiet road called Suburban Drive. Nothing special about this road. Nothing that would make you slow down. Nothing that would make you look twice. He spots a garbage bag sitting in the brush just off the road. He almost walks past it. He doesn't. Inside that bag were the skeletal remains of a child. Duct tape wrapped around the skull. A blanket printed with Winnie the Pooh characters. 15 houses from her own home. Her name was Caylee Marie Anthony. She was 2 years old, and her mother had waited 31 days to report her missing. We are going through every single one of them. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand who these people were, because this case is not just about a crime. It is about a mother, a daughter, a family, and 31 days of choices that still haunt everyone who followed this story. Caylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005. She came into the world at Arnold Palmer Hospital for Children in Orlando, Florida. From the moment she arrived, she was the heartbeat of the Anthony household. Her grandparents, George and Cindy, were completely wrapped around her little finger. George had spent years working in law enforcement. Cindy was a registered nurse. They were stable, grounded people who showed up for their family. And the moment Caylee was placed in their arms, they were done. She was everything, and Caylee, by every account from every single person who ever spent 5 minutes with her, was pure joy wrapped in a little body. She loved Winnie the Pooh more than anything. She loved to dance around the living room to whatever music was playing. She loved to help her grandfather in the yard, following him around like his little shadow, handing him things she was too small to understand the purpose of. She called her grandmother Cindy every single day, not every few days. Every day, just to talk, just to connect. People who met her once remembered her. Strangers smiled at her in grocery stores. There was something about Caylee Anthony that made adults stop what they were doing and pay attention. She was the kind of child that made you believe the world was still a good place. And she loved her mother. That is the part of this story that never stops being painful to sit with. Caylee had absolutely no reason not to trust Casey. She was 2 years old. Casey was her entire world. She reached for her mother the way every child reaches for the person they believe will always keep them safe. She had no way of knowing what was underneath the surface of that world. But underneath that surface was something else entirely. Caylee Marie Anthony was born on March 19, 1986. She grew up in the same house on Hope Spring Drive in Orlando, where Caylee would later be born into. She was, by most accounts from those who knew her growing up, a social and charming young woman. Pretty, confident, easy to like on first impression. But Caylee Anthony had a gift that had nothing to do with charm. She could look you directly in the eyes and lie with complete, total, unshakable conviction. She had been doing it for years before Caylee was ever born. For 2 full years, Casey left the house every single morning and came home every single evening pretending to go to work at Universal Studios. She dressed for it. She timed it. She described her days with enough specific detail that her parents never questioned it. She had not worked there in years, but the deception went deeper than a fake job. Casey had been systematically stealing from the people closest to her. She wrote checks from her mother Cindy's account without permission. She drained money from her grandmother's savings. She stole credit card numbers from family friends and used them to go shopping. She borrowed hundreds of dollars from friends with elaborate stories about why she needed it urgently, knowing full well she would never pay a single cent back. She forged documents. She invented employers. She created fictional versions of her life and delivered them with such complete confidence that the people who loved her most accepted them without question. Her friend Amy Huizenga trusted her completely. When Amy discovered money missing from her own account, Casey looked her in the eye and said she had no idea what had happened. Her parents trusted her. When they found discrepancies in their finances, Casey had explanations ready before they finished asking the question. This is not background information. This is not a character detail to file away and move past. This is the engine that drove everything that happened after June 16th. Because when you have spent years building an entire life out of lies, when you have trained yourself to perform under pressure, when deception is your first instinct and not your last resort, when you have looked the people who love you most in the face every single day and felt nothing, a lie is not a desperate measure. It is just Tuesday, June 16th, 2008, a Monday morning, Father's Day. George Anthony told investigators he saw Casey and Caylee leaving the house together that morning. Caylee was wearing a pink shirt. She had her little backpack on. She turned around at the door and looked back at her grandfather. She waved. That was the last time anyone outside of Casey's immediate circle would see Caylee Marie Anthony alive. George went to work. Cindy went to work. Casey drove away with her daughter. What happened in the hours that followed is something Caylee Anthony told at least 4 different versions of over the course of the investigation. The stories shifted depending on who was asking and what they already knew. Locations moved, timelines changed, names were added, and then quietly dropped. But one thing stayed the same in every single version she ever told. She drove away with Caylee that morning, and she came back without her. She would not return to her parents' home for 31 days. Day 2, June 17th. The morning after Caylee was last seen alive, Caylee Anthony showed up at her boyfriend Tony Lazaro's apartment without Caylee. Tony Lazaro was a 24-year-old student at the University of Central Florida. He and Casey had only been dating for a matter of weeks. He had met Caylee briefly, just once or twice in passing. He liked Casey. He had no reason to question her. He asked where Caylee was. Casey said she was with the nanny. The nanny's name, according to Casey, was Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. People close to Casey knew her simply as Zanny the nanny. She did not exist. Investigators later located a real woman living in Florida who shared that exact name. She had never met Caylee Anthony. She had never babysat Caylee Anthony. She had never been inside the Anthony home on Hope Spring Drive. She had no connection to this family whatsoever. But Casey had been casually dropping Zanny's name into conversations for years. She mentioned her so consistently, with such relaxed familiarity, that friends who knew Casey simply accepted that this person was real. Nobody asked to meet her. Nobody asked for a last name. Nobody pushed for details. Casey had built this fictional nanny so carefully and so patiently over such a long period of time that when she needed to deploy her now, the groundwork was already done. Tony believed her. Of course he did. He had no reason not to. And Casey moved into his apartment. Days 3 through 9, June 18th through the 24th. This is the part of the story that takes the longest to absorb. Caylee Anthony settled into life at Tony's apartment as though a switch had been flipped. She unpacked her things. She went shopping. She used stolen funds to buy clothes and personal items at Target and other stores around Orlando. She went to the pool. She watched movies in the evenings. She cooked. She made plans for the coming weekends. Her text messages from this period are extraordinary in what they reveal about her state of mind. She texted friends about social plans. She texted Tony with the kind of casual warmth you send when you are happy and comfortable and exactly where you want to be. She complained about small things. She made jokes. There is not a single message from this period that reads like a woman who has lost a child. Not one. On June 18th, just 2 days after Caylee was last seen, Casey texted a friend to ask about upcoming plans for the weekend. On June 19th, she and Tony went out to eat and spent the evening at his apartment watching television. On June 20th, just 4 days after Caylee was last seen alive, Caylee Anthony went to a nightclub called Fusion Ultra Lounge with Tony Lazzaro and a group of friends. She danced. She drank. She entered a hot body contest that was being held at the club that night. She smiled for photographs with her arms around her friends, with the kind of smile that does not come from someone trying to hold grief together in public. This was not a woman pushing through pain and pretending to be okay. This was a woman who was genuinely having a good time. Those photographs were later entered as evidence in her murder trial. They were taken while Caylee Anthony was already dead. Let that land for a moment. Investigators believe Caylee died on or very close to June 16th, the same day she was last seen leaving the house with her mother. The medical examiner would later rule her death a homicide. Casey knew what had happened. She knew where Caylee was, and 4 days later, she was on a dance floor competing in a nightclub contest. Days 10 through 16, June 25th through July 1st. The days kept stacking. Casey kept building. On June 25th, she borrowed $300 from Amy Huizenga. She told Amy the money was urgent because her nanny had stolen from her and she was in a difficult financial position. A nanny who did not exist, stealing money that was not stolen to justify borrowing money that would never be returned. One lie constructed entirely to support another. She went to Blockbuster with Tony. She picked out movies. She stood in line and made small talk and acted exactly like someone whose biggest concern that evening was what to watch. She bought groceries. She went to the gas station. She did the ordinary, unremarkable things that people do when their lives are proceeding normally, and there is nothing catastrophic sitting just beneath the surface. Then on June 30th, something happened that would become one of the most forensically significant moments of the entire investigation. Casey's car ran out of gas on East Colonial Drive. Instead of calling roadside assistance or a tow truck, she pulled the Pontiac Sunfire into the parking lot of an Amscot Financial Center and abandoned it there. She called Tony's roommate, not her parents, not a tow service, and asked him to come pick her up. She left the car sitting in that parking lot and walked away from it without looking back. When George Anthony went to retrieve the vehicle several days later, he knew something was catastrophically wrong before he was even close to it. The smell reached him from outside the car. He would later describe it on a 911 call. He said it smelled like a dead body had been inside that car. George Anthony had worked in law enforcement. He was not someone who used that phrase casually or imprecisely. He was not wrong. He just did not fully understand what he was right about yet. Day 17, July 2nd. 17 days since anyone had seen Caylee alive. 17 days since she waved goodbye at her grandfather's door. Caylee Anthony walked into a tattoo parlor in Orlando. She sat down in the chair and told the artist exactly what she wanted. 2 words. Bella Vita. Italian for beautiful life. She sat there and made conversation while the needle moved across her left shoulder. She was relaxed. She was present. She was not someone sitting in a tattoo chair trying to hold herself together. She walked out with those words permanently marked on her skin. Years later, in a courtroom, Prosecutor Jeff Ashton asked Casey directly what those words meant to her at that specific moment in time. Not in general, not in the abstract. At that moment, 17 days after her daughter was last seen alive, with no missing persons report filed, with police knowing nothing, she could not give him a straight answer. She deflected, she shifted, she looked down. She never could answer that question directly. But the tattoo was permanent. And so was everything it revealed about who Caylee Anthony was in those 31 days. Days 18 through 29, July 3rd through July 14th. The world kept moving, and Casey moved with it. She helped her friend Amy Huizenga search for a new apartment to rent. During one of those conversations, Caylee told Amy she could have her parents' house on Hope Spring Drive soon, that George and Cindy were planning to move somewhere new and the property would be coming available. Her parents' house, where Caylee's bedroom was still exactly how she had left it on the morning of June 16th, where her little drawings were still held to the refrigerator by magnets, where her Winnie the Pooh toys were still sitting in the places she had left them, where her grandfather called Cindy from work every day, asking if they had heard anything from Caylee. Caylee was not grieving behind closed doors and performing happiness in public. She was redesigning her future. She was looking at apartments with a friend and offering her parents' home as a rental option, as though the people inside that home were simply obstacles to be routed around. During those same weeks, Caylee Anthony was becoming increasingly desperate. She had not seen Caylee in nearly a month. Every time she pushed Caylee for access, Caylee had a reason. They were at the beach. Caylee was napping. The nanny had taken her somewhere. "Everything is fine, Mom. You need to stop worrying." But Cindy had been worrying since the first week, and by mid-July, the worry had become something closer to terror. Day 31, July 15th, 2008. Caylee Anthony did not wait for Caylee to come to her. She tracked her daughter down and went to the apartment where Caylee had been staying. She walked in. She brought Caylee home to Hope Spring Drive. And that is when Caylee Anthony found out, for the first time, sitting in her own living room, that nobody had seen or spoken to Caylee in over a month. Cindy called 911. On that call, her voice was completely broken. She was crying. She was shouting. She moved between rage and desperation with every breath. She told the dispatcher her granddaughter was missing. She told them about the car and the smell. She said her daughter was not telling her where Caylee was. Then she said something that was picked up clearly on the recording. She said the car smelled like there had been a dead body in it. Caylee Anthony was in the room during that call. She was not crying. She was not on her knees demanding police find her daughter immediately. She was arguing with her mother in the background. She was frustrated and irritable and annoyed in the way a person gets annoyed when a conversation is not going the way they planned it. 31 days. That is how the world found out Caylee Anthony was gone. Not because Caylee broke down. Not because guilt became too heavy to carry. Not because she looked at herself in a mirror one morning and could not live with what she saw. Because her mother backed her into a corner and left her no exit. From the moment police arrived at the Anthony home on July 15th, something was immediately and visibly wrong with how Caylee was carrying herself. She was cooperative. She smiled at officers. She answered questions. She walked them through her story with a calm that seasoned detectives found deeply unsettling. But every single piece of that story fell apart the moment anyone checked it. She told police she had last dropped Caylee off at an apartment complex called the Sawgrass Apartments with the nanny on June 9th. Officers went there within hours. Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez had never lived at that complex. Not one resident recognized Caylee's face. Not one person recognized Caylee's photograph. Then came the moment that investigators who worked this case still talk about years later. Caylee told police she worked at Universal Studios. Officers offered to drive her there to assist with the investigation. She agreed immediately and without hesitation. She walked them through the front gates. She moved through corridors and hallways with the practiced confidence of someone who belonged there. Then she stopped. She turned to the detectives standing on either side of her, and she told them she did not actually work there, that she had not been employed there in years. She had just walked law enforcement officers through a secured facility in the middle of a missing child investigation as part of a performance she could not sustain for more than an hour. Still performing, still lying, even here, even with everything beginning to close in around her. Over the following days, investigators brought Caylee in for multiple formal interviews. Each session revealed new contradictions. Each time they caught her in a specific lie, she adjusted the story, shifted the timeline, introduced a new detail to explain the discrepancy. She never broke. She never looked at a detective across a table and said the words that everyone needed to hear. She just kept building, layer after layer after layer. A structure made entirely of lies. When forensic investigators processed the Pontiac Sunfire, it became one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. The FBI laboratory confirmed the presence of chloroform in the trunk liner, not in trace amounts, not in quantities that could be explained by ordinary household items or accidental contamination. At levels that one forensic expert described on the stand as shockingly high. A single strand of hair recovered from the trunk showed what analysts call a death band, a dark ring that forms at the root of a hair after the body it belongs to has begun decomposing. DNA analysis confirmed the hair was Caylee Anthony's. Caylee had been in that trunk. Every witness who had encountered the smell from that car described it the same way without being prompted by each other. Independently, consistently, using the same language. A smell you do not forget. A smell that is not groceries or a gym bag or a dirty diaper. A smell that tells you immediately what it is before your brain has time to process the information. Then, investigators turned to the family computer. Inside the search history from the months before Caylee disappeared, someone had searched for how to make chloroform. Someone had looked up the effects of various chemical compounds on the human body. Someone had searched terms related to death and loss of consciousness and undetectable substances. The prosecution argued those searches were made by Caylee Anthony. The defense challenged that evidence harder than almost anything else in the trial. They produced their own expert who disputed the forensic methodology and challenged the timeline of when those searches were made. But the chloroform found in the trunk of that car and the chloroform searched for on that computer in the months before Caylee disappeared sat next to each other in that courtroom and asked a question that no one could fully explain away. December 11th, 2008. 6 months after Caylee was last seen alive. Roy Kronk found the bag in the brush off Suburban Drive. Among the remains, investigators found duct tape that forensic analysis linked to a roll recovered from inside the Anthony home. They found a laundry bag. They found the Winnie the Pooh blanket that Caylee had been so attached to in life. And they found something that silenced the courtroom completely when it was introduced at trial. On the duct tape that had been wrapped around Caylee's skull, analysts found the faint residue of a heart-shaped sticker. A heart. Cindy Anthony told investigators that Casey used to put heart-shaped stickers on Caylee's drawings, on her handmade cards, on the little pieces of artwork that a 2-year-old makes when someone sits down on the floor with them and gives them paper and crayons and time. A heart, on the tape, around her skull. Take a moment with that. Because there is no version of that detail that does not devastate you if you let yourself actually think about what it means. By May 24, 2011, when Caylee Anthony's trial formally began, the entire country had already made up its mind. This was not just a murder trial, it was a national event. Seats in the public gallery were distributed by lottery because the demand was overwhelming. Cable news networks dedicated entire prime-time blocks to live coverage. Millions of people streamed the proceedings from their phones, their desks, their living rooms. America had not watched a trial with this level of collective intensity since 1995. Prosecutor Jeff Ashton presented his case with surgical precision. He laid every piece of evidence before the jury in sequence. The smell in the car, the hair in the trunk, the chloroform, the computer searches, the 31 days documented in phone records and receipts and text messages and photographs, the tattoo, the lies told to police, the lies told to friends, the lies told to the detectives who sat across from her for hours. He called over 90 witnesses. He built a case that he believed left only one possible conclusion. His most devastating moment came during closing arguments. He told the jury that the Bella Vita started June 16th. 6 words. The entire 31 days in 6 words. Defense attorney Jose Baez had a completely different strategy, and he deployed it without hesitation. In his opening statement, he told the jury Caylee had not been murdered. He said she had drowned in the family swimming pool on June 16th in an accident, and that George Anthony, who was home that morning, had discovered the body and had helped Casey cover it up. He said the behavior that shocked a nation during those 31 days was not the behavior of a killer. It was the behavior of a profoundly traumatized woman who had been sexually abused by her own father since she was 8 years old. a woman who had been taught from the time she was a child to smile over pain and perform normalcy and never let the truth reach the surface. George Anthony took the stand and denied every single word of it. He denied the drowning. He denied helping to cover anything up. He denied the abuse with the kind of raw emotion that is either genuine devastation or extraordinarily convincing performance. Then came a moment nobody in that courtroom anticipated. Cindy Anthony took the witness stand and told the jury that she was the one who had searched for chloroform on the family computer. Not Casey, her. She said she had been researching something related to her dogs and that the search had led her to information about chloroform. The problem was that her employment records showed she had been at work at the hospital on every single day those searches were conducted. A mother was sitting on a witness stand in front of a jury deciding whether her daughter would receive the death penalty, and she appeared to be committing perjury to save her child's life. That moment captured everything broken and tragic about the Anthony family in a single exchange that no one who saw it will ever forget. Baez returned again and again throughout the trial to his central argument. You cannot prove how she died. You cannot prove the cause of death. If you cannot establish cause of death beyond a reasonable doubt, you cannot return a verdict of murder. He planted that seed in the first hour, and he watered it every single day until the jury went to deliberate. 10 hours and 40 minutes later, they returned. Caylee Anthony, not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, not guilty of aggravated child abuse. The reaction outside that courthouse was immediate and complete, and unlike anything that building had ever witnessed. People who had waited in line for a seat in that gallery wept openly on the steps. Social media responded with a fury and a volume that broke records at the time. Legal commentators who had covered trials for decades sat in front of live cameras and could not find words. The disbelief was total. How? How did 12 people sit through all of that evidence and say not guilty? The answer requires you to set aside how you feel about Caylee Anthony and engage with how the American legal system actually works. The prosecution could not prove how Caylee died. They could prove she was dead. They could prove decomposition in the trunk of that car. They could prove the smell. They could prove 31 days of choices that no innocent parent would ever make. They could prove every single lie Casey told from the moment police arrived on July 15th. But they could not place a weapon in Casey's hand. They could not identify a cause of death that the medical examiner could confirm beyond any reasonable doubt. They could not close every door that Baez had opened. And reasonable doubt is not a suggestion in American law. It is the entire standard. 12 people deliberated. 12 people concluded that the evidence, as overwhelming as it felt, did not eliminate every reasonable doubt. Caylee Anthony was convicted of 4 counts of lying to law enforcement. She was sentenced to time she had already served in jail awaiting trial. On July 17, 2011, 13 days after the verdict, she walked out of the Orange County Jail in the early morning hours, free, while Caylee Marie Anthony remained in the ground. The years after the verdict were not kind to the Anthony family, not to any of them. George and Cindy's marriage fractured under the weight of everything they had survived together. George, who had been accused of sexual abuse and criminal cover-up in front of the entire country, gave interviews in the years that followed that painted the picture of a man who had lost everything he had built his life around. His granddaughter, his reputation, his family, any future he had imagined for himself. The woman whose name Casey had stolen, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, filed a defamation lawsuit. She testified about what happened to her life after her name became attached to this case. The harassment from strangers, the damage to her career, the weight of being publicly connected to the murder of a child she had never met. Caylee Anthony gave occasional interviews over the years that followed. She spoke about the media's treatment of her. She described her experience of the trial and the verdict and the years of public hatred that came after it. In nearly every one of those interviews, she talked about herself. She rarely talked about Caylee, and that absence, that consistent and deliberate absence of her daughter's name from her own account of her own life, tells you more about Caylee Anthony than any piece of forensic evidence ever could. It is easy to let this story become about Casey. The lies, the dancing, the tattoo, the verdict, the interviews, The years of watching her continue to exist freely in the world while Caylee does not. There is enough anger here to last a lifetime, and every bit of it is valid. But this was never really about Casey. It was always about a little girl with curly dark hair and wide bright eyes who loved Winnie the Pooh and loved to dance and called her grandmother every single day just to hear her voice. Caylee Anthony never got to go to her first day of school. She never had a best friend. She never lost a tooth. She never learned to swim. She never had a sleepover or a birthday party or a moment where she looked in a mirror and started to understand who she was becoming. She was 2 years old, and the one person in the entire world who was supposed to love her most, protect her most, put her first above everything and everyone else on this earth, chose themselves instead. The justice system made its decision based on the evidence it had. But the 31 days speak for themselves. Every night at the club, every borrowed dollar, every text message sent while her daughter's body was in the trunk of that car, every smile for the camera. Every morning she woke up in Tony Lazzaro's apartment and chose not to pick up the phone. Caylee Marie Anthony deserved so much better than that. She deserved the whole world. She got 34 months of it. Say her name. Caylee Marie Anthony, born August 9, 2005. She mattered then. She still does now.